Welcome everyone to the What's Up Doc series. This is video number 4. It's been a minute, hasn't it, John?
Yep.
Some technical difficulties 2 weeks ago, but John is looking particularly fantastic today. He's got his beautiful blue shirt on and his beautiful background. It's got a virtual background. Where is that again?
That's the Mekong River.
Mekong River.
At Three Gorges, just above the Three Gorges Dam.
Oh, it's beautiful. Very good.
Yeah, that was a gorgeous trip. My wife and I took that trip up the Mekong River from the Three Gorges Dam all the way up to the navigational end of the Mekong River.
What an adventure.
Yeah,
well,
it was pretty exciting.
We'll have to talk about that a little bit further. But for today we have a special topic for everyone who's listening, don't we, John?
Yeah, it's something from the middle of the night.
Something from the middle of the night we're going to explore, and I'm giving it an acronym, UISP. The UISP stands for Unity, Imaginal, Symbolism, and Physical. So if you don't have any question marks, then I don't know what to say, because I have plenty of questions on this one, John. So it was in the middle of the night. Tell me about how you were introduced to this UISP, the Unity, Imaginal, Symbolism, and Physical, why these 4 words popped up.
Well, that's a good question. I have no idea. Stuff happens to me in the middle of the night, and night is my favorite time.
Okay.
A lot of creative energy flows for me at night.
Yes.
And a lot of, well, I think it might even be very similar to meditation, but I don't think people usually think of meditation happening at night. You tend to think of that in the daytime, and then you go into a state that's very different from not meditating during the day. Mm-hmm. Whereas at night, the difference between meditating and sleep can be kind of fuzzy. At least it is for me.
The alpha theta states, right? It's that sleep wake state. Yeah.
Yep. And oftentimes I don't actually have conscious awareness of what state I'm in. I do have an aura ring, which is a ring that monitors the state of your sleep, the condition of your sleep, the various waves, deep sleep, light sleep, REM sleep and such, and the heart rate variability, as well as your heart, a bunch of things.
Yeah.
Monitor. And so oftentimes the next day I have to look at that ring to get some idea of what conditions were maybe likely occurring.
Yeah.
Because I never know.
Do you have an idea of what condition you were in when these 4 words came in?
I think it's more like sort of halfway between being awake and being asleep.
The sleep-wake state. Okay, yeah, that's one of the times where I'm able to pull out quite a few interesting things. I know a lot of people do sleep-wake state. You're able to access different treasure troves of consciousness at that level, aren't you, to bring that forward?
Yeah, and it's fun. It's a fun level. And it's not one that I can choose to be in or not to be in. I mean, it comes on its own. Mm-hmm. And it has its own nature, as far as I can tell. But in it, I'm actively participating as well as listening. So it's almost like a conversation, but it's not clear who the other person in the conversation is. So, but these 4 words, it took me a while to think about them and see why they were put together. And for me, in thinking about them, because they don't necessarily jump out as an obvious outline of something. Particularly the symbolism. And the way I'm beginning to see it over the past few weeks is that unity is where everything starts. it all
Okay.
starts at unity. And to us, you know, unity is infinity. I mean, uh, it's indistinguishable from nothing and everything. I mean, it's not easy to deal with, to even
No,
define.
can't
At least,
define it, can you? Words won't do it justice.
no, but there is a sense of its meaning, at least
Uh-huh.
maybe a visceral sense. Um, Imaginal is the closest thing, I think, that, at least for me, that I can get into, that is the closest to unity.
Okay.
So imaginal is in the, you know, the realm of thought, the realm of non-verbal connections, subtle energy, spirit. In this, the domain, this imaginal domain, is where all of these kinds of things that we can't measure, but we know they exist.
Mhm.
That this is giving a word to where they exist, to some domain in which they exist.
And that's the imaginal. So just to make sure we're putting a concrete foundation for the audience and myself, that this is where you can't, this is the aspect of reality and all that is of what we cannot measure, but that
Yeah,
is the consequences of this results in what we do measure, what we can measure.
right.
So going from the start of infinity or the unity to the imaginal, such as the subtle energy realm, you said there were thoughts, nonverbal, and spirit. And this is really where that transition between spirituality and science, that area that we can't quite measure just yet, but know that it's there based on quantum physics and insinuations. This is where some necessary attention needs to be made, but I just wanted to make that clear. But that's fantastic. You gave it a name. So
Right.
awesome.
Well, consciousness, for example, is in the
Yeah.
imaginal domain. Awareness,
Consciousness and yeah.
self-awareness. These are things that, you know, philosophers and theologians and these get talked about a lot, but they're, for me anyway, they seem to be inner concepts.
Okay.
They exist everywhere, but um, it's possible to take the viewpoint of everywhere as well as my particular viewpoint or your particular viewpoint. And so it's not that it's inside of the conscious person only. It's
Mhm.
obviously outside, and it's everywhere. I mean, and it permeates everywhere, everything.
Mhm.
So it's something that's not measurable.
Mhm.
At least at this stage, it's not measurable.
That we know of, right?
That we know of.
Yeah.
But it's something we can get access to, in a sense. That it is possible to access, you know, the infinite, by using ratios of quantities,
Mhm.
relative, in relative sense. It's possible to access the uh, the imaginal domain in a sense.
Mhm.
And that's the next step, of course, is, well, how do we do that? How do we connect to
Mhm.
this imaginal domain? And it's the symbolism.
Okay.
Right? And so this symbolism allows us to access the, to use our understanding and our concepts and the patterns we extract from the physical reality.
Mhm.
And then as we extract these patterns, we use symbols to represent those patterns
Mhm.
and share understanding and knowledge between each other, and do this in a community way. And science is one of the ways that we do that.
Mhm.
But the symbolism is key for us to get from this physical domain, which is something that we can measure. We can take a third person perspective on some phenomena.
Yeah.
I mean, take gravity. Okay, we want to understand more about gravity, and so then you start to do some experiments, and immediately you start to create symbols for the things that you're measuring, for the establishing connections between different phenomena. So symbolism becomes the key to trying to extend what we know from the physical domain into the imaginal domain.
Mhm.
That symbols are the key to doing that. And language is symbolic in the sense that words are symbols for things. Sometimes we forget this. Sometimes we forget that a word is a symbol, but they really are symbols. They are not the things that they represent to us.
That's a critical point. That's a critical point for personal growth and freedom.
It is critical, and it is certainly personally for me to understand, because, I mean, people kill each other over words, and
Yeah.
they're just symbols. They're not the thing that the words are referring to.
Yeah. And the symbolism can detract from the enrichment of the true reality in which we're interacting.
If we live in the symbolic world,
Yeah.
then we miss the magnificence, the beauty, the miraculous nature of reality.
Mhm. Say dog. Dog, for example. Well,
yeah,
do you look at, you say dog, that's a dog. Oh, your mind says dog, and you get a picture of a dog
yeah.
or a word of a dog, or you spell it out. And like, that's a dog, and dismiss it instead of this beautiful, majestic, unconditional creature smiling and drooling and looking at you with stars in its eyes, its beautiful fur. You know, you dismiss, it's dismissive, very limited. Yeah.
Yeah, not only that, it's got the most phenomenal smelling sense of any mammal. And it's what, 100,000 times more sensitive than the human sense of smell. I mean, it's a miraculous creature. It's
Yeah.
when you start to look at how this body functions, how this dog's body functions. I
Yeah.
mean, and the beauty associated with this fine tuning of these sensors inside of its nasal passages. All right, and the nerve connections between those sensors and the brain, right, and how it can distinguish just hundreds of scents. I mean, and it's capable of, of determining. I mean, I've read about experiments they've done with dogs, that are just mind blowing. I mean, you can put something in a room in a building and then burn the building down and then take that thing and hide it someplace, and the dog will go from the burned building and it'll trace your whole path back and find that.
Yeah.
Right? And all it had to begin with was a scent of this thing before you burned it into just about all ash, right? So you take the ashes out there and the dog goes and finds the ash. I mean, it's just, but you just say dog, and what does that mean? I mean, it's
Symbolism doesn't cut it.
it doesn't cut it. It really doesn't cut it. And if you live your life in the symbols, you risk, I think you risk missing the real essence
Okay,
of
yeah.
who you are.
I realized in science that mostly everything is symbols.
Yes.
And I'm like, I'm not tangibly experiencing and testing anything, to a certain extent, to the extent that how much of the foundation is symbolism. And I needed the unity imaginal with the physical. I'm like, there's more to this, but to understand that the symbolism itself is a necessary stepping stone, it is a gradient, is a transient thing that is very useful. But another thing with this unity imaginal symbolism physical, the UISP that we're discussing today, is that this really does show a gradient of source energy coming in and to create the physical, and that the physicality in itself is never separate from the spiritual, from the metaphysical, from source energy, from whatever you'd like to call it.
Yeah.
Whether it be the Holy Spirit or energy, depending on which side of the fence you're on, they're inseparable.
Yeah. 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 And the symbolism is very, very complex and elegant that
It
we
is,
use.
yeah.
It's nested symbolism. So probably the highest level or the most superficial level of, from a science point of view, would be words and language. Language is all symbolic representations of the reality. And if you're doing science, you can't do it without language. I mean, language is the way you communicate. Language is the way you share within the community, and it's also the way you organize the knowledge that you have.
But
that knowledge is organized through the whole language and how you speak the language, and languages are really different. The symbolism can be extraordinarily different. I mean, and I realized this when I learned a little bit about the Hebrew language and the Aramaic language, that they're closely connected, but they have a really fundamentally different set of thought patterns than, say, English does, or the Indo-European languages, German, French. I mean, these Western European languages have a sort of a linear structure to them and a linear way of thinking, and they're naturals for a process like science. They slide into the whole scientific paradigm of how to view the world and how to organize measurements and discover patterns. Whereas some of these other more Eastern languages, particularly Middle Eastern languages, are not organized in this linear way. They're organized more in a parallel way, and the relationship between the speaker and the listener is really quite different in the two languages. And so that symbolism, the fact that different languages have different sorts of patterns that they exploit in the process of converting experiences into symbols that you can use to pass on to somebody who's never had your experience. So it's, and then when you take, say, the English language, and then you pile on top of that the mathematical language. So now you have the mathematical symbolism nested in the language symbolism.
Yeah.
And mathematics has its whole complete set of symbols that it uses. And it, in a way, it's mathematics, at least to me, is mysterious. It's
Yeah.
mystery how faithful it seems to be able to emerge as a useful means for us to extract patterns from a lot of separate observations. And through the use of language, how we can get more complete global understanding of contributions that are made by people all over the world.
I think that's, yeah, it's got a huge use to it. I like how you're able to go through and start out, do a gradient with the usefulness and then the limitations and the different languages. And science itself it's reported in English for the most part across the globe. And
Yeah.
a lot of our reality is dictated by our language.
Yes.
Because we're living within the symbolism, because we're living in the symbolic aspects of the language. And if we look at language, we're limited by the language itself to a restriction of duality and separation in response to the format of the language itself. Would it be easy to say that there's more separation and duality ingrained in the language of English than there is in the ancient languages such as Aramaic that you're describing, where there's a different relationship between the observer and the observed?
I think I don't think that the exploration of science is limited in any way by any particular language.
Okay.
But I think what happens is the ability of people to share their knowledge requires them to have a common set of symbols. And the key to science is that you have reference points that are unquestionable and unchangeable.
What about science and spirituality? If we have a language that parses those out as dualistic and separate,
Yes.
at the language level, do you think that's one of the reasons spirituality and science hasn't converged as seamlessly as we were hoping?
Yeah, I think that's exactly true. If you, for example, from what I've read in Aramaic translations to English of some of the scriptures in the New Testament, is that, you know, the notion of the process of breathing and the of an individual or an animal or insect, whatever it is, the breathing process that's so essential to the survival of that individual is inseparable from the breathing process of the earth, which happens through the wind and the atmosphere. It's the atmosphere that serves the same function that for the globe that the breathing does for the individual. And that there's only one word in Aramaic for all of that.
We can,
All right, for both the breath that we take to stay alive and the earth's breaths in the form of the wind, there's only one word for that in Aramaic. So the concept of unity is more easily comprehended in a language like that. In English, how many different words do we use for breath and wind and I mean, spirit? I mean, the same word is used for wind and spirit and breath in Aramaic.
So how does that language efficiently communicate? Just from a perspective of the audience who doesn't know much about language, myself included, really, context would be extremely important within a language like that. Is that correct?
Oh, yes, it is. And in fact, I'm making inferences here, and I'm not a linguistic person. I've never studied linguistics, but
you've been studying Aramaic for a while, translations of ancient.
I've been reading them, and I've gained some sort of personal knowledge about how I think the difference.
I think it's fantastic. A scientist's perspective on this is fantastic.
Yeah, and it is that in English, the idea is to try to convey not only the same idea and knowledge from the speaker to the listener, but it's for both the speaker and the listener to have the same context. And English functions best in this mode. And when the two people have a different context, the speaker has one context and the listener has another context, right? I mean, a perfect example is someone who is a conservative and someone who is a liberal. And they're trying to have a conversation with each other, and one has the context of a liberal and the other has the context of a conservative. And they're using the same words and they're arguing, right? I mean, they're arguing because each person has a different context and they've never really established the same context between them.
Yeah.
And so a language like English is trying to shoehorn all of us into establishing the same context as we try to communicate with each other.
And that leads to definition too, where a lot of arguments are based on having a different definition for the same word and not understanding.
Yeah, because we have multiple definitions for individual words. You can have 2 or 3 or 4 definitions that conflict with each other, all associated with the same word. And the only way that a person understands the meaning of that word is within their own context.
Yeah.
The speaker has one context. If the listener has the same context, the communication is clear.
Yeah.
But if the speaker has one context and the listener has another context, then those 2 words are fighting. You end up with a fight between 2 people because they have a different context. And the challenge with English is the context is not carried with the syntax of the language. So the context is something that each person develops in a conversation. At least this is the way I see it. Right. So if a conversation occurs.
So let's go back and define context and syntax for the audience real quick so that they can follow.
Context is, to me, is the sort of nonverbal state that a person carries with them in the conversation. And it has to do with their beliefs, their perspective on life, their life experiences, their history. A lot of things affect this context. And it's not an easy thing to define in an absolute sense. And we do have certain words we give to contexts, but they're not universal either. So the context is a hard thing to transmit between people, and people who spend a lot of time together learn the contexts of the different people.
It's critical.
If you're in a small tribe, you know, in the Amazon in South America someplace, then you know everybody in your tribe and you know their context because you've lived with them, you've communicated with them, you've shared your life with them. I mean, you've shared your food with them. You know them in a nonverbal way. And so you know everybody knows everybody else's context. And so that becomes a much closer group.
And then what about syntax for the audience?
Syntax is the way the language is organized. You know, in English, you have a subject and a predicate.
Perfect.
And oftentimes you have an object. And there's you could diagram, basically you can use symbols and diagram the sentence structure. And so if you're speaking English, you know, the verb comes early in the sentence. If you're speaking German, the verb comes at the end of the sentence. That's because they have a different syntax. And so it's the structural organization of the words in the language, the punctuation, that sort of thing. The kind of thing that you convey with the words you pass to another person. So as long as you both have similar definitions for the words.
That's the critical part, yeah.
And that's another critical piece of the thing. But it's, we don't always know that we're using the same definitions.
Don't always know, no.
Particularly with some of the colloquial words that are changing and evolving through the cultural changes and evolution. and they haven't gotten into dictionaries yet. I mean, so then
Yeah.
you have a lot of trouble with those things, and they get weaponized real easily to,
Yeah. Trigger and
yeah, so that language becomes kind of a weapon. And
the
that
symbolism.
happens.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
Sorry, the symbolism itself here is really fascinating because I can take so many different approaches, even thoughts and beliefs. Just everything from a simple word. You said people will kill over a word.
mhm.
They'll kill over a word because there's a thought and a belief system behind that word. There's
Yeah,
there's a context, right?
it's not hard to find an example either.
No, not hard to find an example. And then there's an attachment to your structure to that context and belief and structure and symbolism.
Right.
So without having an association of your identity with that particular word or context or thought, then if someone disagrees, you're personally attacked.
Yeah, it's because you formed an unhealthy attachment to this word.
An unhealthy attachment. But if you're not attached to it and you're open to other context,
Then you learn the most this way.
then you learn. That's where wisdom comes in.
Yes.
And understanding.
Yeah.
And where people from different areas can sit at a table and say, wait a minute, you said the word dog. I'm thinking of a Labrador. You're thinking of a poodle. They're pretty close.
Mhm.
Maybe we can make a Labradoodle out of this thing. Cross the aisles.
That's what we do with syntax, is that we kind of do a lot of creative exercises with language and symbol.
Yeah.
And the real problem comes in this context, because in the English language, communication only really happens clearly if both people have at least a very similar context for the discussion they're having. Which is why sometimes if you meet a stranger, you only talk about kind of superficial things, unless one person does all the talking, which happens sometimes. But you talk about simple things to try to get a notion of what the context is for this person.
That's the most critical part in coaching. It's context, communication, context, teaching, context.
Yeah.
All of it. Communication comes down to context, effective communication in all forms.
It does. And the problem is it's not carried in the syntax of the language itself.
That's a critical point.
That's beyond the symbols. It goes beyond the symbols, and there's a lot of integration that's happened inside of the speaker and listener that might be similar and it might be conflicting.
Okay.
And so it's a complexity. In Aramaic, my 2-bit sort of impression is,
okay,
and I don't even know if a linguist would agree with this, but my impression is that they have fewer words in Aramaic and in Hebrew as well. They're closely related. A lot of words have the same root in Hebrew as they have in Aramaic. But the fewer words means that more different meanings get chucked into a single symbol.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And so the language as a whole seems to permit the speaker and the listener to have different contexts and to be able to communicate.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the precision with which they communicate is probably less specific than it would be in, say, English, which has many, many more words and a more complex syntax. So in a sense, you can say, well, the person who's speaking has a context that's different from the person who's listening. So the speaker is talking about one set of concepts, has one perspective, and the listener has a different perspective.
Mhm.
But the features of reality that are captured in the one word that they have in Aramaic are in some holistic kind of way connected. Right?
Yeah. In science, the separation of the observer from the observed, the scientist from the observation,
Right.
all the way
Yeah.
down to the syntax and, well, context and the embodiment and foundation of the language itself. It's all there.
But English is a useful language for this purpose in
Yeah,
science.
that makes
And
sense.
so what it means is that the speaker in Aramaic might have a different specific example in mind, then gets generated in the mind of the listener.
Yeah.
But they still have a connection to each other. Okay, and so the two people can have a different context and still communicate with each other. And they have a different specific example that might be relevant to the listener, but not the speaker.
Mhm.
And the speaker might have a specific example of that's clear to the speaker, but the listener doesn't understand it. But the two still communicated with each other.
Okay.
I mean, to me, it seems to offer more flexibility for communicating between people who have, say, very different exposures to or experiences in their life and in the world that they live in.
Absolutely.
And
And
so
yeah.
you don't transmit exactly the same message, literally the same message. And when you try to translate something like Hebrew into English or Aramaic into English, the translator gets to choose which word he wants
Yeah,
to use.
pick and choose.
Yeah,
Pick and choose. There's
in
yeah.
the case of this word where the same Aramaic word is used for wind and for spirit, the King James decides to use wind. I mean, so you can really slant the translation because of the fundamental differences in the languages and the way they're organized and their structure.
And talk about translations of translations of
Yeah,
translations.
it is, and I've seen some of these 3 to 5 word phrases in
Yeah, you told me
English,
that.
in the New Testament, translated into 5 or 6 whole sentences, right? So they might, it might be, 3 Aramaic words, and you end up with 5 sentences in English trying to capture what the meaning possibilities are for those.
And I'm just
But
gonna go. I'm gonna go ahead
you're
and
only
say.
going to pick one as a translator. You've got to pick one, right?
Yeah,
I mean,
I'm gonna go ahead and say it. There's been misinformation, purposeful misinformation, and also neglectful and not by intent, where the meaning of really important spiritual manuscripts has been altered.
well, yeah, and it isn't necessarily intentional
Not
because
always.
no, because we all have a perspective. We all have
Yeah.
a context. And if you take any one person and do a translation, it's going to be colored by that person. And if someone else does it, it's going to be a little different. And if the person who does the second translation read the first one,
Mhm.
he's going to be influenced by the first one, right? And so the tendency is going to be that they're going to be more alike than different.
Yeah.
So but it isn't wrong, right? I mean, that translation in the.
Well, I can give an example where you could have, to say Yeshua or Jesus, casted 7 demons out of Miriam, right?
Yeah.
You go back into ancient scrolls. Some resources said it was off of Miriam, not out of,
Uh-huh.
meaning that she was actually being assaulted. She wasn't actually demented or have demons within. So to understand the significance of out versus off has substantial significance when it comes to important manuscripts
For us.
for us and our understanding of the
Yeah.
paradigm.
In the original language, it might not matter.
The original merit, it may not, 100%. Yeah.
They may have one word for both of those.
Yeah.
And that's the tricky part. It
Mhm.
means I can really understand why the Jewish traditions have kept the Hebrew language. I've often wondered why they did that in their worship services. And boy, I've known a lot of Jewish colleagues who can speak and read Hebrew.
That's awesome.
Pretty impressive.
Yeah, it is impressive. Hang out with some
Impressive.
cool friends, John. You got some cool friends hanging out with you, man.
Yeah, yeah. Well, now I understand it. I understand it because the context is really different. I mean, the language itself can't be easily translated into
No.
another language. I mean, and so this symbolism is really crucial for how we move from our physical experience
Yeah.
into this imaginal space.
So coming back to UISP, that's the unity, imaginal, symbolism, and physical. What were some of the aha connections that are applicable within these different dimensions that you've been processing the last few weeks?
Well, I think the piece that has hit me in the face the hardest.
Okay, hopefully a good way. Good way.
Yeah, and in a good way. Yeah,
Good.
is how we have lost the appreciation for the limitations of symbolism,
Okay.
and we latch on to the symbols and make our decisions on the symbols when we're not actually living the experience that the symbol is representing.
That's like driving while intoxicated, is what it sounds like.
Well, yeah. Well, and the end result is we fight a lot.
Yeah.
We have these disagreements over things that actually are not that different experientially.
Yeah.
But the words become, a tool or a way to do violence to somebody else. All right, through the tool. The language, the tool, the symbol is being used like a baseball bat to bang somebody over their head when they're dealing with an experience that's not that different from my experience.
So it's the illusion of separation. It feeds into the illusion of separation.
Yeah, it's interesting because symbolism is really powerful. Wow, when you look at what you can do in science with mathematics and the power of turning qualities into quantities, and that mathematics really does this in superb ways. It's a mysterious how well mathematics extracts patterns from, or how well we extract patterns using mathematics, the symbolism of mathematics. So symbols are really, really powerful, and it's probably one of the characteristics of human beings that separates us from all of the mammals. I mean, maybe all other animals, is that we use those symbols. And those symbols are powerful for us. it's the way in which, to me, we've been able to almost control the planet.
Yeah. Does that go back to the old adage when I was a young boy, people say mathematics is the language of the universe? Would that be a good reference
Yeah.
point here?
Well, it's our language for the universe.
Our language for the universe.
Yeah.
We can't speak for the universe, I guess, right?
Yeah, yeah. I don't know about the universe. It doesn't need to use symbols. It just is.
Doesn't need a language. Yeah.
Yeah, it's got beingness.
Yeah. Yeah,
Uh,
it's being, it's thing.
yeah.
Yeah.
But symbols have all this power that we have. I mean, science wouldn't exist without symbolism. I don't think at all.
So how do we, is there a way to use symbolism to facilitate unity instead of separation?
Well, it's that word unity.
Yeah, so that's another symbol.
It's a symbol, and everybody thinks
Here we
of
go.
something else when unity, and it takes a lot of sentences after using that word
Wholeness.
to try to
Yeah.
convince somebody of what my context is, and probably for them to describe what their context is as well.
That's another show, and it's
Yeah, that's right. But at the same time, it's got all this power.
Yeah.
It's also very precarious. I mean, we can get intoxicated with the power of this thing and destroy ourselves with it. So something that's powerful can allow you to conquer great obstacles, but it can also allow you to destroy yourself.
Yeah.
I mean, and so this is this balance that seems to kind of be at play all the time in reality.
Yeah, I would say that a lot of what's going on is a lot of things that happened in the past and different timelines and different projections are having too much power without understanding having the understanding and wisdom behind the power. It's having the power too early on in development. And I relate this to being like a monkey with the machine gun.
Yeah.
And so we see that, and we see that in areas of tinkering with the human genome since the beginning of whatever timeline you decide to look at. And we also see that with certain experiments where we don't really know exactly what is going to happen. At some level of consciousness, it is known. At other levels, it is not. So with great power comes great responsibility. But the question is, do you have the understanding and knowledge to have that? And what are these certain fail-safes set in place, within the protective universal system for people when they do receive power, that they have the understanding and wisdom to do so. And so this is where we can come and go into a different avenue, but it's just going to throw that out there, that it's important to have the wisdom and understanding along with the power. And sometimes it's not always the case, is it, John?
Well, no. And in the case of science, I don't think that sentence of with great power comes great responsibility, because I don't think scientists generally consider that they are responsible for what they discover.
That's a good point.
I mean, and so if you look at the role of science in our society today, it's got a very, very big role. And if you look at the evolution of our perspectives over the last 400 years, it has to be one of a few of the most influential factors in our evolution.
Absolutely.
And so when you look at how it works, and there's a really good analysis of how it works in this book called The Knowledge Machine by Michael Strevens.
Okay.
He describes it better than I've ever seen described before. And I think most card-carrying scientists might not be impressed with the way he expresses it.
How did he express it? Do you remember?
Well, he talks about something
Gist?
called the iron rule.
What's that?
Well, the iron rule is that measurements rule.
Hmm.
It's measurements that have the final say in whether something is true or it's not true.
Hmm.
You always rely on the measurements. The measurements have to be done meticulously. The methodologies have to be described meticulously. Every detail has to be taken care of. The uncertainties have to be known. These are iron rules in science. And if you don't make measurements of high quality and do it well, you'll be ostracized. You'll be neglected. No, people will not take you seriously if you're a sloppy experimentalist.
Well, even today in the field, in the right circles of true science, it's still the case.
Yes, this iron rule is at work today, and it's absolutely ruling how scientists make their decisions. And the journal system, the publishing system, is where these methodologies are scrutinized by your colleagues
Mm-hmm.
and torn to pieces if they're not sound. And so this iron rule is the most objective part of the science itself, of the pursuit of knowledge by the method of science. It,
But it does not get rid of
well,
the
and
imaginal. That's the thing, is we assume, I was trained, I never come into the imaginal to later on, but having that particular, we have the symbolism, we have these different things, the golden rule, but there's a whole nother, we talked about separation of the observer from the observed. There's a whole nother dimension to this that we definitely could go into, but yeah.
yeah, and that's only part of how he describes science.
Okay.
This is the pseudo-objective part. It's as objective as a group of people can be, where everyone in the group is subject to the same criteria of a measurement, that the method is independent of anybody's opinion.
Yeah.
Right? Opinions don't, when it comes to measurement, the measurement itself, there's no room for opinions or feelings or emotions or anything else like that. And if there's some question about some aspect of the measurement, then you have to resolve it.
Yeah.
And the uncertainty in the measurement is crucial, because every measurement has uncertainty. But on the other hand, the interpretation
Yeah.
of the measurement is subjective.
Yep.
Right?
That's where the politics comes in.
Yeah, that's where the politics of science comes in.
Yeah.
Right. And it's not anything like the iron rule.
Well, I think people are realizing that more and more.
Yes, it is. And of course, on my take is there's literally thousands of unstated assumptions in science. And there's always more assumptions than there are
Conclusions.
yeah, conclusions. And but we write down some of the assumptions that are new, that maybe haven't been there before, but we forget the old ones. When we forget the old ones, I mean, everybody considers mass, length, and time to be the fundamental metrics by which we make all of our measurements. Well, at least all of our spatial measurements. I mean, we have other standards, but those things all of our standards are relative. Everything that's done in science is relative. None of it is absolute, but we don't talk that way as scientists.
May I make just a plug? I think you can actually revolutionize the consciousness and push the consciousness of science forward and evolution forward through the subjective, subjective perception of the results of a study, what they could mean, what they may not mean, and push it forward, just push it And I think originally that's what it was used for, was to push it, consciousness, the conclusion, the knowledge, the understanding, to an evolutionary understanding, to progress. But at some point, when it quits doing that, then the politics can come in and usurp the true evolution of that topic and feeds a particular concern or result or whatever that could be, you know.
Well, as soon as you get that subjective component, you get biases.
Yeah.
And then you form groups that are opposing each other, and somebody's right and somebody's wrong. And that whole argument is all over the symbols again.
Yeah, and we go back to the symbolism. Yeah.
Yeah, and the best way to resolve those differences is to take the people from the two perspectives and have them do a joint experiment, work together. But oftentimes it doesn't actually work that way in science. The two sides just keep marshaling more and more and more data until finally one side wins out and the other side loses. I mean,
Yeah.
and everybody loses on that approach instead of taking the two sides and putting them together and accomplishing more that way. There's this bugaboo in science all the time about creativity.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, because people create new things. We create new things that never existed before. And when we do that, we create something from nothing. I mean, and so it's this thing that creating something from nothing is an anathema in science, right? It violates all the conservation principles. So you can't, the scientist can't deal with creativity. So that's not his realm. All right?
Okay.
It's not my charter to deal with creativity. If I'm creative, so much the better for me. If I'm not, well, that's just the way it is. All right. But studying creativity is, I mean, there are ways to enhance it and encourage it.
Yeah.
And provide a more nurturing environment for more of it to happen. But it's not something that we measure.
Well, I think the creativity, I'd have to say that Unity is quite creative.
Oh yeah, just look at the dog's nose. And you realize that not only did nature somehow put this thing together, but it put this thing together probably 100,000 or 1,000,000 years ago.
I hope our audience is looking forward to staring at a dog after this session. You know,
Yeah.
can't wait to see a dog now.
Well, my wife and I read books together. Where
Oh, that's beautiful.
She reads out loud while I do the dishes.
Yeah.
And that way we both have a stake in the kitchen.
That's smart. Yeah.
Yeah. But we're reading a book now called Sentient, which is just talking about the amazing nature of what we would think of as ordinary animals.
Okay.
I mean, the owl. How does the owl hear?
I mean, it's
so well.
It's phenomenal. It's
phenomenal the way it can. And you know, the owl's ear, in fact, our ear does the same thing, but you can get a map. You get a three-dimensional map in the brain of the owl of what the owl is hearing. So the owl can do this sort of three-dimensional conformal mapping of all of this signals it's getting from all these different directions. It's got a three-dimensional map. So when it gets to one that's something it can eat, it knows exactly where it is, right? And it's incredible. You know that the face of the owl, you know, they always are depicted as having these big eyes, and being wise. Well, those feathers in the front of its face are actually parabolic dishes that focus the sound waves coming in onto the ear at the apex of them.
Wow.
Imagine how elegant nature is, that it's down to this, it's creating these dishes.
I know. Everywhere
And,
you look, it's like an ant or a leaf and photosynthesis. And
oh, gee whiz, it's so
I just
amazing.
I have to make the plug. Creative energies and everything. And creative energy is sexual energy. Sexual energy is creative. We should all be happy that our creator is sexual, or else we wouldn't exist. And that's a polarity, right?
Yeah,
But we are co-creators in our reality. So we have the capability and we're ingrained to be creative.
yeah, yeah.
And that's
But,
co-creation at its fundamental core. And humanity is a very powerful co-creator.
oh yeah, but
So it's
we have to be really careful to not get overly enamored with our symbols.
that's, yeah. Do you think the symbolism decreases creativity to a certain extent if we're over enamored?
Well, you can use the symbolism to enhance your creativity too.
I think that's critical. Yeah.
The problem is that how do we balance this? How do we balance these benefits of symbolism against the disadvantages of symbolism? I mean,
And intuition.
yeah, yeah,
Intuition. So you don't get, if you rely all on intellect, you're done.
yeah,
You're done. You're dead in the water. You
yeah.
have to balance the intellect with intuition and listen to yourself beyond logical, rational cognizance. Then you have a chance.
Well, but you know, as a scientist, at least I know this was the problem I suffered from, was that you get pretty focused on a limited group of symbols and a limited piece of reality that you're actually studying.
Yeah, you're really good at a small sliver.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and that means that acquiring the knowledge is the first step. You know, building the
Yeah.
understanding is also important, and it's
Yeah.
and that in that case you got to both manipulate the symbols and appreciate the physical reality as well as the symbols you use to represent it, and understand all of those relationships. But the piece that for me was always missing from science is the wisdom part.
Mm.
It's like the wisdom part, that's up to the philosophers or the theologians or somebody else. That's not my part as a scientist. And it's the wisdom part that deals with responsibility. And you were mentioning earlier, you know, with great power comes great responsibility, but science has great power. We can destroy the earth. We can destroy, for our purposes, for the purposes of humanity, we can pretty much destroy humanity as it exists today on the whole earth if we choose to do it. But that's, and what's to stop us from doing it? Certainly science isn't going to stop us from doing it. That's a wisdom issue, and there's no wisdom in science.
Let me just repeat that. There's no wisdom in science.
Yeah.
Let's go into that a little bit.
Well, I guess the first place I would start would be, well, what is the definition of wisdom? And
It's always the best point.
if you try to go into the dictionary, you can find a definition for wisdom. But if you look at the words that are used in the definition, things like, you know, integrity and honesty and forthrightness and openness, and, you know, are all traits of someone with wisdom. If you look at those words, you find out that if you look up honesty, you'll find words like integrity and truthful. You go look up truthful, you find words like honest and integrity.
Yeah, circular.
But they're all circular. I mean, they're all you're just using this array of words that you associate with wisdom. You're using that array of words to define the other words internally. So I think wisdom is something that is not easily defined. It's something you know it when you encounter somebody with wisdom. You know that, you can tell that. But if you try to intellectualize it and you try to capture that in the mind, you can only do that very superficially in the mind. You can't get at the essence of wisdom with discrete definitions for what it is. I mean, we create symbols that represent it, and we know if someone is honest or if they're not honest. I mean, by what they do. And if what they do is different from what they say they did, they're not honest. But
Yeah.
but this whole thing gets to be very muddy, very non-specific. I mean, and we have our court case, you know, and we try to determine whether someone was truthful or not. Our whole legal system is based on wisdom. And yet science doesn't, to me, in my opinion, science doesn't have anything to do with wisdom. If as a scientist, you know, the scientist finds out that you can split an atom, and if you do this in a certain way, you can make a bigger bomb. Does he say, well, I don't want to make a bigger bomb? No, well, he wants to make a reactor and make electricity. So he does that, but in the process, he makes the bigger bomb. I mean, and it's, you can see how the conundrum, the scientist faces a conundrum because he really doesn't know where what he's doing is going to take him.
Yeah.
He's on a path, he's following a path consistently through his symbolism, and a lot of that's through the mathematics. I mean, we wouldn't have a lot of physics without the mathematics to quantify it.
So for the state of the future, if we were to looking back on our understanding and knowledge, and your understanding and knowledge of the scientific field as you see it, do you think it would be beneficial to mankind to actually implement an infrastructure of wisdom for the scientific community from the ground up?
How would you do that?
Well, it's a stimulatory question.
I think that wisdom is something scientists can have, and many do.
So they can have it. And it's a big thing about integrating the wisdom into this infrastructure of the science.
I think it disappears as the infrastructure develops.
What
I mean, if you look at the physicists from the early 20th century, you know, Max Planck and
let's talk a new system. We know the old system, it was excised out, but what if we could make a new system where it was integrated?
Well, that would be nice. I think it would be nice if we could do that. But I think there's too many unknowns in this to know where it's going to come out. But
there's always too many unknowns to know anything.
Yeah, and it's a lot of that is predicated on the assumptions that we make that we never revisit.
So that's just, assumptions.
The unstated assumptions we don't revisit. But the early investigators in quantum physics, for example, Schrodinger and de Broglie and Einstein and Planck, and those people were very philosophical.
Yeah, I was just gonna say there's a philosophical bend to this.
Well, yeah, they were very philosophical, and a lot of them wrote about it and demonstrated that they had a lot of wisdom related to this, but it didn't stop them from doing the work that led to the atomic bomb, because they had no idea that's where it was going.
I know Einstein had some regrets.
Yeah, and so science is this really powerful tool, but it can take us down as well as up.
I learned that
And
one.
And it has, and it has, because wisdom is something people have. The pursuit of science doesn't have it. I think we have a hard time even defining it. We know it when we see it, but the definitions aren't that easy to come by, short of using one symbol to represent another symbol.
Well, maybe in this case, it would be acknowledgement of responsibility.
Well, I think Oppenheimer acknowledged his responsibility and regretted it,
Okay.
but Teller didn't. So, I mean, some of them do recognize their responsibility, and
I'm talking about the infrastructure. Within the infrastructure to implement an acknowledgement of responsibility within the infrastructure of the experimentation, the hypotheses, you know, even having a committee, you know, just thinking about ways you could implement this for future, for food for thought for the future generations.
we've tried to do that some with our ethics.
How did that go?
Well, it hasn't gone really well.
No, it hasn't.
And in the end, academia has relied on the court system to resolve ethical issues within the academy. So yeah, I mean, committees are established. Look into ethical.
Well, I'm familiar with the committees, but it's what they're focusing on and what they're rewarding. So what is the system rewarding? It's rewarding positive data to survive and get a grant. We don't have, you know, we've been calling for negative data journals for decades. So we can save federal funds, so we can not replicate an experiment that won't get us a result that will feed forward. Thinking about evolutionary perspective, at a scientific perspective, just having the importance of negative data being treated as an equal to positive data, which positive data being you proved your hypothesis to be correct.
But there is a downside to that too.
What's that?
I hear what you're saying. If I use myself as an example, I would have anywhere from 10 to 50 negative outcomes for every positive one. Now,
Okay.
maybe I'm just a slow scientist and I'm not.
You were pretty prolific. For anyone who doesn't
Well,
understand, he helped develop regenerative agriculture before it was called that.
But it's still the negative results by far heavily outweigh the positive ones. And right now we have hundreds of thousands of journal articles a year, and you can't even get to all of the journal articles in your own special narrow area of research. So if you put all the negative stuff out there, you would just bury everybody, because there's so many more negative results.
Yeah, I understand the intangibility of it. Maybe you could come up with a search engine criterion within a particular niche, label it down, look for keywords, but at least understanding that you're not having people fudge data for their own survival, right, within the system, or having people only look for proving themselves correct, and only being proven correct is not only going to fuel a trajectory that's not completely forthright and transparent, but it's also going to fuel your ego, which is going to grow out of control to teach you to be correct all the time.
Well, seems to me the best way to do that is for a scientist to be motivated by something that has nothing to do with science.
And that's ironic, isn't it?
That way. I mean, for example, if what's most important to a scientist is the purity of their heart, is their honesty, their integrity, and the purity of their heart, their faith in positive outcomes, their faith in God, their faith in the spirit, religious faith, I mean, or anything that's outside of science that they believe in firmly. That is what allows them to be more honest with everything that they're doing within science, because there's no outcome from what they're doing that's going to sway them. So there's nothing in the science community or the science endeavor on its own that's of powerful enough significance to them to sway them away from whatever their external motivation is.
Yeah,
Right. And
it's a
so,
critical point. That's a solution. That's part of a critical point solution right there.
yeah, that to me, that's the most important way to do this. Yet in science, just the opposite has happened.
But I want to commend you, John. You were able to do that. You did that.
Yeah, but that was because of an external impact on me. It was nothing I did.
I understand you're not getting, but you still were, that's how you operated, and it facilitated a flourishing of your career.
It did.
Yeah.
Yeah, it did.
So you're a living example that it can work, and then it can assist your career.
In my case, it did.
My case, I can't say that. You can definitely say that.
I can.
And that's fantastic. So I want everyone to know that's legitimate.
Yeah. Well, I've been blessed my whole life, and so feeling gratitude for the life that I've had is something that's very important to me. To be thankful for all of the blessings that I've had in my life, and the most important branch points in my life and my career, and always were resolved on their own.
Yeah, and I see
had to compare apples and oranges and pick one or the other.
Yeah, I just see an underlying thread of love from that assisted you in unifying that.
Yeah.
And love for the people you worked with, the results, Mother Earth, the relationship between soil, and all of that we need to get into, and some of the groundbreaking spiritual holistic synergy. But with regards to traversing the different dimensions of unity, the imaginal and symbolism and physical, is there an underlying force that ties them all together, other than the first thing that comes to me is love in that last example, because I could feel the love for you and understanding the true definition of love at a much deeper level, and being able to know that the main factor underlying unity, the imaginal, and the symbolism and the physical, all that we're talking about, when it seems to be disjointed and compartmentalized and separate, there's nothing that true love cannot unify. Do you agree with any of that?
Yeah, I think love is the mechanism that connects these four concepts together. It's love that makes those connections between unity and the imaginal and symbolism and the physical. Love makes all of these transitions. That's the kind of love that I am committed to.
I know.
So my physics is as grand a demonstration of love as my relationship with my wife is.
I know.
I mean, and that really changes how I look at things that are easy to externalize from us, like the soil. I mean, the soil is like my mother. You know, I mean, so many of the microbes that are in the soil are also in my gut, and I wouldn't exist without them. I mean, so the exchange, to me, love is involved in every single exchange that happens from the nano levels, the tiniest, smallest levels, to the galactic levels. All of these exchanges and everything that's going on, all of that's animated with love.
And that love's a relationship, isn't it?
It's a relationship. And if one thing is related to another, that's
You're in-
love.
It's
And
love.
in the end, everything is related to everything.
Mhm.
And it's easy to live inside too much, and it's easy to live outside too much,
Mhm.
on the internal or the external.
Mhm.
And it's again a balance. All of these things are balancing the polar opposites.
But the balance is there. It's naturally ingrained into the fabric of your.
Well, it's certainly the forces that exist in reality are constantly restoring balance.
Yeah.
And life is imbalance, which is kind of interesting. That,
Yeah.
life is not equilibrium. Life is non-equilibrium.
Mhm.
And it's not balance. Death is balance.
Interesting. Yeah. We'll have to.
So you can see that the conundrums of reality are built right into the workings of everything.
Yeah.
So it's a challenging place, but it's a magnificent place.
Yeah. Is there any final send-offs for today's audience? As we
Don't
started.
get
What was
stuck in,
that?
don't get stuck in symbols.
Don't get stuck in symbols. Okay, I would have to agree from someone who's been stuck in symbols.
I have been too.
Yes.
I have spent a lot of my life stuck in symbols.
And understand what symbols, how far the symbols reach, within your own makeup, within your own psyche, within your own experiential relationship to your world. Really understand what that relationship is. And if it's really grasping the magnitude of all that is.
Yeah.
Go to if you don't have a dog, go to your neighbor's dog. Go outside until you come across someone and stare into those beautiful apertures of the universe staring back at you with that magnificent nose going up and down. And understand that symbolism has a purpose, but it's also at times, if not applied appropriately, can limit the ecstasy and enchanted kingdom that we live in, called reality, that we help create.
Yeah, the agony and the ecstasy.
The agony and the ecstasy. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and send us off. Everyone have a wonderful week. And I look forward to our next session, which will be What's Up Doc session number 5. And have a wonderful time. And I look forward to providing another wonderful session with John in the next upcoming weeks. Until then, namaste.